Struggling Cowboy won a pregnant girl at auction. Then the judge called her his daughter. He had $37 to his name and used every cent to buy a pregnant girl at auction. But when the judge arrived 3 days later, Thomas Mercer learned that some purchases come with a price no man can afford to pay. The courthouse steps groaned under the weight of shame that September morning, each weathered plank bearing witness to another month's harvest of human misery. Thomas Mercer stood at the back of the crowd, his hat pulled low over eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. The silver coins in his pocket felt heavier than stones. $37 that represented every honest day's work he'd managed to scrape together since spring. Around him, men shuffled their boots in the dust, some studying the ground as if searching for lost dignity, others eyeing the platform with the cold calculation of merchants at market. The September sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air thick as molasses and making everyone's clothes stick to their skin like guilt. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge catching the harsh light like a warning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, though there were precious few ladies present and even fewer gentlemen, "we gather here today for the monthly settlement of debts and obligations, as decreed by territorial law." Thomas had seen these auctions before. Desperate people selling themselves into servitude to pay debts they couldn't manage, their labor bound for years to whoever bid highest. It was legal, which somehow made it feel worse than if it had been outright slavery. At least slaves could hold onto the knowledge that their chains were wrong. These people signed their own papers. The first man on the block was a farmer named Peterson, his hands still stained with soil from the land he'd lost. His wife stood in the crowd, her face turned away, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Peterson went for $42 to a cattle baron who needed hands for the drive north. As they led him away, his wife finally looked up, and Thomas saw something die in her eyes. Next came an old Mexican man who spoke little English, his weathered hands telling the story of a lifetime spent working other men's land. He went for $28 to a mine owner who promised him food and shelter in exchange for his remaining years underground. The man nodded as if this was mercy. Then she appeared. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat as a young woman climbed the courthouse steps, her movements slow and careful, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. She couldn't have been more than 19, with dark hair that caught the light like spun copper and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. But it was the way she held herself that struck him, straight-backed despite her condition, chin raised despite the circumstances that had brought her here. "Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore," Sheriff Morrison announced, his voice softer now, as if even he felt the weight of what was happening. "Age 19, with child, skilled in cooking, cleaning, and household management. Debt of $63, to be settled through labor contract." The crowd stirred like wolves catching scent. Thomas watched faces around him change, saw the calculations behind their eyes. A pregnant girl would be vulnerable, desperate, grateful for any kindness. Some men stepped closer to the platform, and Thomas felt his stomach turn. "Bidding starts at $10, Morrison called. "12, came a voice from the front. A saloon owner Thomas recognized, a man with hands that had never known honest work and eyes that had never known honest intentions. 15, called another, this one a rancher whose wife had died the previous winter and whose children spoke of him only in whispers. Thomas watched the girl, Sarah, as the numbers climbed around her. She stood perfectly still, but he could see the small tremor in her hands, the way her breathing grew shallow. She was trying to disappear inside herself, to survive this moment by becoming someone else entirely. $25, the saloon owner called again, and Thomas saw the cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The coins in Thomas's pocket seemed to burn against his leg. $37. Everything he had. Everything he'd saved through months of riding fence, breaking horses, and eating beans from a can while dreaming of something better. It wasn't enough for much, maybe winter supplies, or repairs to his cabin roof, or feed for his aging horse. But it might be enough for this. $30, Thomas heard himself say, his voice carrying clear across the courthouse yard. Heads turned toward him, surprised murmurs rippling through the crowd. The saloon owner's eyes narrowed, studying this unexpected competition. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on Sarah, and for just a moment, their eyes met across the dusty space. He saw something flicker there, not gratitude, exactly, but maybe the faintest spark of hope. 35, the saloon owner countered, his voice harder now. Thomas felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the September heat. $3 left. $3 between this girl and whatever hell awaited her in that saloon's upstairs rooms. 37, Thomas called, his voice steady though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence stretched long enough for a crow to call from somewhere beyond the courthouse walls. The saloon owner studied Thomas with the calculating gaze of a man weighing profit against pride. Finally, he spat into the dust and turned away. Sold, Sheriff Morrison announced, bringing his gavel down with the finality of fate itself. To Thomas Mercer for $37. As Thomas walked forward to complete the transaction, his legs felt unsteady beneath him. He'd just spent every cent he owned on a pregnant stranger, and he had no earthly idea why. The papers felt rough in his hands as he signed them, binding this girl to him for the next 2 years or until her debt was paid. Sarah climbed down from the platform slowly, one hand still protective over her belly. When she reached him, she stood quietly, waiting for instructions, for demands, for whatever cruelty she expected would follow. Instead, Thomas tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said simply, "I reckon we best get you somewhere you can sit down proper." She looked up at him, then, really looked, as if trying to solve a puzzle written in his weathered face. "Why?" she whispered, the first word he'd heard her speak. Thomas considered the question as seriously as if she'd asked him to explain the movement of stars. The honest answer was that he didn't know, couldn't explain the impulse that had moved his hand, opened his mouth, emptied his pockets. All he knew was that some things were too precious to let slip into the wrong hands, even when you couldn't afford to catch them yourself. "Sometimes a man's got to act on faith," he said finally, "even when he ain't sure what he's got faith in." As they walked away from the courthouse together, Thomas felt the weight of those silver coins settle somewhere deeper than his empty pockets. He'd bought more than a labor contract today. He bought a responsibility that would either save them both or destroy whatever was left of his struggling life. Behind them, the courthouse bell began to toll, marking the end of another auction, another month's worth of dreams sold to the highest bidder. But Thomas didn't look back. He had bigger concerns now than his own empty future. He had someone else's to worry about. She hadn't spoken more than 10 words in 3 days, but when she finally broke her silence, Thomas realized he'd brought home more than just a pregnant stranger. He'd brought home a mystery that could destroy them both. The wagon wheels carved shallow trenches in the prairie dust as Thomas guided his old mare toward home, each rotation carrying them further from the courthouse and deeper into uncertainty. Sarah sat beside him on the wooden seat, her back straight despite the obvious discomfort of her condition, hands folded over her belly like she was protecting something sacred from a world that had already proven itself unworthy. The silence between them stretched like the endless grassland around them, broken only by the steady clop of hooves and the occasional creak of wagon wood settling under the weight of their shared awkwardness. Thomas had never been good with words, especially around women, and this situation defied every social convention he'd ever learned. What did you say to a person you just bought at auction? How did you explain an act of charity that had left you broke and her bound to you by law? How far? Sarah finally asked, her voice barely louder than the wind moving through the prairie grass. "About 2 miles more," Thomas replied, grateful for any sound that wasn't the weight of his own thoughts. "Got a small place. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof that mostly keeps the rain out and a stove that burns clean." She nodded without looking at him, her gaze fixed on the horizon where heat waves made the air dance like spirits. Thomas found himself studying her profile from the corner of his eye, the determined set of her jaw, the way she breathed carefully, as if each breath required conscious effort. There was something refined about her features, something that spoke of better circumstances than the ones that had led her to that courthouse platform. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when Thomas's homestead finally came into view. It wasn't much, a small log cabin with a stone chimney, a lean-to barn that housed his mare and the few chickens he'd managed to keep alive, and a vegetable garden that had seen better years. The whole place looked tired, worn down by wind and weather and the constant struggle of trying to make a living from stubborn land. Thomas pulled the wagon up beside the cabin and climbed down, his joints protesting after the long ride. He moved to help Sarah down, but she was already managing it herself, one hand on the wagon side for balance, the other still protective over her belly. She stood in the dust of his yard, looking around with eyes that seemed to catalog everything. The sagging fence posts, the weathered shutters, the pile of firewood that needed splitting. "It ain't much," Thomas said, suddenly seeing his home through her eyes and finding it wanting. "It's quiet," Sarah said, and there was something almost like relief in her voice. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A single room served as kitchen, dining, and sitting area, with a ladder leading up to a small loft where Thomas kept his bedroll. The furniture was handmade and practical, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a few shelves holding his meager possessions. Sunlight filtered through oiled paper windows, casting everything in a golden haze that somehow made the poverty look almost peaceful. "You can have the bed," Thomas said, nodding toward the narrow cot in the corner. "I'll make myself comfortable up in the loft." Sarah turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since they'd left the courthouse. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she'd posed before, but with more weight behind it now. Thomas removed his hat and ran his fingers through hair that needed cutting. "I reckon everybody deserves a chance at something better than what they're running from," he said. "And I reckon sometimes a man's got to act on what feels right, even when he can't explain it proper." "What if I'm not running from anything?" Sarah asked. "What if I'm just exactly what I appear to be up there, a girl with nowhere else to go and nothing else to offer?" "Then you're still a person," Thomas said simply. "And persons shouldn't be bought and sold like livestock." Something shifted in Sarah's expression then, like ice beginning to crack in spring. She sat down heavily in one of the chairs, one hand pressed to her lower back, and for the first time since he'd seen her, she looked her age, young, scared, and impossibly tired. "The baby's due in the winter," she said quietly. "November, maybe December." Thomas nodded, already calculating in his head. They'd need more firewood, more food stored up, maybe some extra blankets. His savings were gone, but there were other ways to make money. Odd jobs in town, maybe some work breaking horses for the cavalry post. It would be tight, but they'd manage. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We?" Sarah asked, and there was something almost like surprise in her voice. "Well," Thomas said, settling into the other chair, "I reckon when you buy someone's labor contract, you also buy a share in their troubles. Seems only fair that works both ways." For the first time since he'd seen her, Sarah almost smiled. It was barely there, just a slight softening around her eyes, but it transformed her face completely. Under the weariness and fear, Thomas caught a glimpse of who she might have been before whatever circumstances had brought her to that auction block. "I can cook," she said, "and clean. I can earn my keep." "I'm sure you can," Thomas replied. "But for now, why don't you rest some? Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about earning anything." As evening settled over the prairie, Thomas busied himself with the simple chores of daily survival. Feeding the chickens, checking on his mare, splitting enough wood for the morning fire. Through the window, he could see Sarah moving carefully around the cabin, touching things lightly as if learning the geography of her new life. When he came back inside, she was standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled like actual food instead of the beans and hardtack he'd been living on for months. She'd found his small store of potatoes and onions, maybe some dried meat, and somehow transformed them into something that made the cabin feel like a home. "Smells good," Thomas said. "It's not much," Sarah replied, but there was pride in her voice, the quiet satisfaction of someone doing something they knew how to do well. They ate together as darkness gathered outside, the silence between them more comfortable now, seasoned with the small kindness of shared meal. The candlelight played across Sarah's face, and Thomas found himself wondering about her story. Who she'd been before, what had brought her so low, whether the child she carried was a blessing or another burden in a life that seemed to have collected more than its share of both. But those were questions for another time. Tonight, it was enough that she was safe, that they were both fed, that somewhere in the vast loneliness of the frontier, two people had found a moment of simple human connection. As Thomas climbed the ladder to his loft later that night, he heard Sarah moving around below, settling into the bed he'd given up. The sounds were soft, domestic, foreign to a cabin that had known only the solitary rhythms of a man living alone. He lay in his bedroll, staring up at the rough ceiling beams, and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. $37, every cent he had, spent on impulse and what might have been foolish charity. But as he listened to the gentle sounds of another person sharing his space, breathing in rhythm with the night wind through the walls, Thomas found he couldn't regret it. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their voices carrying ancient songs of hunger and survival. But inside the cabin, for the first time in years, Thomas fell asleep to the sound of someone else's dreams, wondering what tomorrow would bring to two people who had found each other in the marketplace of human desperation. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was Sarah's voice, soft as a prayer, "Thank you." And in those two words, Thomas heard the beginning of something he couldn't yet name. Something that felt like hope, fragile as morning frost, but real enough to warm the cold spaces in his chest where loneliness had made its home. The most powerful judge in 3 counties rode up to Thomas's cabin with fury in his eyes and papers in his hand. But when he saw the pregnant girl hiding behind the door, his face went white as winter snow. "That's my daughter," he whispered, and Thomas realized he'd stepped into a family war that could get them all killed. The black carriage appeared on the horizon like a storm cloud on a clear day, cutting across the prairie with the kind of purpose that made honest men check their consciences. Thomas was mending a fence post when he spotted it, the dust trail rising behind 4 match horses that moved with the precision of money and authority. Sarah was hanging laundry on the line, her movements slow as her condition demanded. 3 days had passed since the auction, 3 days of tentative conversation and shared meals. Thomas had begun to think they might make something work, not love, maybe, but partnership, peace. The carriage changed everything. "Sarah," Thomas called softly. "Best you go inside." She looked up, following his gaze to the approaching vehicle. Even at this distance, there was something ominous about it, too fine for a social call, too official for good news. Sarah's face went pale, and she dropped the shirt she'd been hanging. "No," she whispered, and Thomas heard a world of fear in that single word. The carriage pulled into the yard with theatrical precision. Out stepped Judge Cornelius Blackwood, his black coat impeccable despite the dust, his silver beard trimmed to perfection, his eyes cold as winter stones. Thomas had heard of Judge Blackwood, the territorial judge who'd brought law to the frontier with an iron fist. He owned half the county, they said, and held mortgages on the other half. His word was law, literally. "Thomas Mercer," the judge said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Judge Blackwood," Thomas replied, removing his hat but keeping his spine straight. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." The judge's eyes swept the homestead, cataloging the poverty. When his gaze fell on Sarah, who stood frozen by the clothesline, his face transformed. The cold authority cracked, revealing something unexpected, pain deep and old. "Hello, Sarah," Judge Blackwood said, his voice suddenly softer. "You look well." "Father," Sarah whispered, and the word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "Father." Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. The pregnant girl he bought at auction was Judge Blackwood's daughter, the most powerful man in 3 counties, and Thomas had unknowingly stepped between him and his blood. "I've been looking for you," the judge continued, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Ever since you left." "I didn't leave," Sarah said, finding her voice. "You threw me out." Remember? When you found out about. She gestured to her belly. Judge Blackwood's jaw tightened. You were unmarried. The scandal was that your daughter was human. Sarah shot back, stepping closer, fear transforming into long-suppressed anger. The scandal was that she made one mistake, and you decided she was dead to you. Thomas stood between them, feeling like a man caught between lightning and thunder. Mr. Mercer, Judge Blackwood said, turning his attention back to Thomas. I assume you weren't aware of who you were purchasing. No, sir, Thomas replied honestly. Then you'll understand this was all a mistake. The judge continued, producing an official document. I'm prepared to compensate you. $50 plus return of whatever you paid. Generous. I think you'll agree. Thomas looked at the paper, then at Sarah, who watched him with eyes that held too much knowledge of disappointment. $50. More money than he'd had in months. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But he remembered the way Sarah had looked on that auction platform, the quiet dignity she'd maintained in her darkest moment. I appreciate the offer, Judge, Thomas said carefully, but I think that decision belongs to Sarah. Judge Blackwood's eyes flashed dangerously. She is my daughter, Mr. Mercer, and you are a man who owns nothing but this patch of dust. Do not mistake my civility for weakness, and don't mistake my courtesy for cowardice, Thomas replied. Whatever's between you and Sarah is family business. But she's under my protection now. Sarah stepped between the two men, her small frame somehow commanding the space despite her condition. I won't go back, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor Thomas could see in her hands. I can't go back to pretending I'm the perfect daughter you wanted. I'm not that girl anymore. You're carrying a bastard child, Judge Blackwood said, the words like physical blows. You've disgraced our family name. And for what? For some drifter who got you with child and abandoned you. Sarah's hand moved protectively over her belly. For love. What I thought was love. Maybe I was wrong about him, but I wasn't wrong about wanting something more than the life you planned for me. Judge Blackwood stared at his daughter, and Thomas could see the battle raging behind his eyes. Love warring with pride, disappointment wrestling with paternal instinct. Come home, Sarah. We'll manage the scandal somehow. Find you a husband who'll take you despite your condition. It's not too late to salvage something. No, Sarah said, the single word carrying a lifetime's weight of decisions. I won't be managed anymore. I won't be fixed like broken furniture or married off to solve your problems. I'm staying here. The judge turned to Thomas, his eyes promising retribution. You have no idea what you're involving yourself in, Mercer. I could destroy you with a word. Don't think your noble gestures will protect you. Thomas met his gaze steadily. Maybe you could judge, but you'd have to live with yourself after. And I'm thinking a man who'd ride out here personally. That's not a man who's given up on love, no matter how hard he pretends otherwise. For just a moment, Judge Blackwood's mask slipped entirely, and Thomas saw the father underneath. Tired, heartbroken, desperate to fix something that might be beyond repair. Then the moment passed, and the judge straightened his coat. This isn't over, he said, climbing back into his carriage. Sarah is still my daughter, and that child she carries is my grandchild. I won't abandon them to poverty, no matter how stubbornly they resist my help. As the carriage rolled away, Thomas and Sarah stood together in the settling dust, both shaken by the collision of past and present. Sarah was crying now, silent tears that spoke of years of accumulated pain. He wasn't always like that, she said finally. When I was little, he used to read to me. But after Mother died, he changed, got harder, started seeing everything as a problem to be solved instead of a life to be lived. Thomas reached out tentatively and patted her shoulder. Folks got their own ways of dealing with hurt. Some build walls, some build bridges. Your father's a wall builder. And what are you? Sarah asked, looking up at him. Thomas considered the question, watching the dust finally settle. I reckon I'm still figuring that out. But maybe it's time I learned to be a bridge builder. That night, sharing another simple meal, Thomas could feel the weight of what they'd taken on. Judge Blackwood wouldn't give up easily, and a man with his power could make life difficult for a struggling cowboy and his pregnant ward. But looking at Sarah, seeing fear replaced by determination, Thomas found he didn't regret his choice. Some bridges were worth building, even when you didn't know if they'd bear the weight of what was coming. The baby's first cry cut through the dawn silence like a prayer, but it was the sound of Judge Blackwood's footsteps on the porch that made Thomas reach for his rifle. Some reckonings come with the sunrise, and some forgiveness is born in blood and tears. Dawn came gray and cold, the morning Sarah's labor began, the November sky heavy with the promise of the first snow. Thomas woke to the sound of her moving restlessly below, soft gasps that cut through the silence like whispered prayers. "Thomas," Sarah called softly, her voice tight with pain. "It's time." The next few hours passed in a blur of boiled water and clean cloths, of Sarah pacing the small cabin between contractions, her hands pressed to her back. Thomas found himself talking to her, offering what comfort he could with words that felt inadequate but seemed to help. "You're doing fine," he murmured during the worst moments. "Stronger than anyone I've ever met." And then, in the space between one breath and the next, everything changed. Sarah cried out, and suddenly there was another voice joining hers, thin and high and absolutely perfect. A baby's first cry, cutting through the cabin like the most beautiful music Thomas had ever heard. "A girl," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "A perfect little girl." He wrapped the baby in clean cloth, marveling at how small she was, how complete. When he placed her in Sarah's arms, the transformation was immediate. Sarah's face seemed to glow with a light that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove. "Hello, little one," Sarah murmured, her finger tracing the baby's cheek. "I've been waiting to meet you." Thomas was cleaning up when he heard hooves in the yard. Through the window, he saw Judge Blackwood dismounting from a fine bay horse, his face grim with determination. "Sarah," Thomas said quietly, "your father's here." Sarah's arms tightened around her baby. "What does he want?" Judge Blackwood's knock was firm, authoritative. Thomas answered it, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind him. "Judge," Thomas said evenly, "congratulations. You're a grandfather." Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or longing quickly suppressed. "I want to see them," he said, his voice softer than Thomas had ever heard it. "Sarah and the child. I need to know they're well." Thomas considered the man before him, somehow diminished by the simple humanity of his request. "That's up to Sarah. But if you hurt her again, you'll answer to me." Blackwood nodded slowly. "I understand." Inside, Judge Blackwood approached the bedside slowly, as if afraid sudden movements might spook them both. When he saw the tiny face in Sarah's arms, he went completely still, emotions playing across his features like weather across a wide sky. "She's beautiful," the judge whispered, his voice breaking. "She looks like your mother did when you were born." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I was going to name her Elizabeth, after mother." "Elizabeth," Judge Blackwood repeated, and the name seemed to take the last of his strength. He sank into the chair beside the bed, all his authority stripped away by the simple miracle of new life. "Oh, Sarah, what have I done? What have we done to each other?" There it was, the admission Sarah had been waiting years to hear. "I was scared," Judge Blackwood continued, his voice raw. "When you came to me pregnant, unmarried, I saw my wife in you, saw all the vulnerability I'd failed to protect in her. I thought if I made you hard enough, you wouldn't be hurt. But I was wrong. I was the one hurting you." Sarah reached out, touching her father's weathered fingers. "I made mistakes too. I should have trusted you enough to tell you about the baby's father from the beginning." "Who was he?" Judge Blackwood asked quietly. "A traveling merchant. Married, with a family in St. Louis. I believed his promises until it was too late." Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes held tears. "I'm sorry. For casting you out, for letting pride matter more than love. Can you forgive a stubborn old fool?" "I forgive you," Sarah whispered finally. "If you can forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," Judge Blackwood replied, gently stroking his granddaughter's cheek. "You were brave when I was cowardly. Baby Elizabeth chose that moment to wake up, her tiny mouth opening in a yawn. Judge Blackwood laughed, actually laughed, and the sound transformed his entire face. "May I hold her?" he asked. Sarah nodded, transferring the baby to her grandfather's arms. Judge Blackwood held Elizabeth as if she were made of precious crystal. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your grandfather, and I promise you'll never doubt that you're wanted, that you're loved." Thomas started to slip toward the door, but Sarah's voice stopped him. "Don't go," she said. "You're part of this too. Without you, I never would have survived. Without you, Father and I might never have found our way back to each other." Judge Blackwood looked up from his granddaughter, studying Thomas with new eyes. "She's right. I owe you more than thanks. I'd like to make you an offer. I have a ranch that need to foreman. Good salary, respect, a chance to build something lasting." Thomas felt his breath catch, but found himself looking at Sarah, at the life they'd begun to build together. "That's generous, Judge," Thomas said carefully, "but I've got responsibilities here." "The contract is void," Judge Blackwood interrupted. "Sarah is free to make her own choices." Sarah looked between her father and Thomas. "And if I chose to stay here?" "With Thomas?" Judge Blackwood smiled, warm and genuine. "Then I'll help you build something beautiful right here. This land could support more cattle, could be expanded. You have my blessing, both of you." As the first snow began to fall outside, Thomas looked at this unlikely family. A judge, his daughter, a newborn child, and a struggling cowboy who'd found his purpose in an act of simple charity. Sometimes the best things in life came not from careful planning, but from the courage to act when your heart told you what was right. Elizabeth stirred in her grandfather's arms, and 3 adults smiled down at her, each seeing in her tiny face the promise of new beginnings, second chances, and the kind of love that could heal even the deepest wounds.